welcome everyone. Good evening. So good to see everyone as always for our wonderful Sephardic Digital Academy. For those who don't know me, my name is Ethan Marcus. I am the managing director of the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America, the national umbrella organization for the Ladino-speaking Sephardic communities in the United States. So happy to have you. Just as a reminder, a couple of reminders actually, excuse me. First, we want to take a moment and thank the Sephardi Federation of Palm Beach County for the co-sponsorship of this three-part series. Secondly, as a general reminder, we always have these kinds of series and classes through a wonderful Sephardic Digital Academy, a national database of sorts for Sephardic classes on history, culture, Ladino language, and so much more. If you're interested in learning more about all classes and programs, please check out our website at sephardicbrotherhood.com. Now, without further ado, we're going to hand off the floor to our dear friend, Professor Louis Fishman, who's associate professor of history at Brooklyn College, and who's just recently wrote a brand new book all about Sephardic Ottoman history and the recent issues in Palestine. And is going to speaking tonight, his third in the part series, specifically about the Sephardic communities, the Ladino-speaking communities of both Palestine and Istanbul and the relationships. So without further ado, Professor Fishman, whenever you're ready, bechavod.
Great, very good. Let me go ahead and share the screen here. And let me get this started. First of all, welcome. You guys can hear me okay? Perfect, great. So welcome back. I see some familiar faces there. Great to see you all tonight again. We're going to, tonight is actually the last lecture in the series. So what we're going to be doing is I'll be sort of summing up some ideas while introducing many more ideas. I don't want you to get too confused. Tonight will be less of a load than the last two classes that we had. Some of it will be review, but hopefully it will help you connect the dots. And that way, when you do go, if you do go and read the book, I always make a pitch for the book. If you go and read the book, you can get on Amazon. You'll be able to understand the book much better. And of course, I think when you go ahead, hopefully when you go and read anything or see any, whether it's documentaries, if you go back to read your family papers, or if you pull out, just some interesting tidbits, you've run into them, you'll be able to understand much better. So thanks for joining me again tonight for our third talk. And interesting enough, we did a lot on Ottoman Palestine. We almost did not even get to Istanbul, which in a way it's ironic that we started with the peripheral and we didn't start with the capital, because we have to remember that Ottoman Istanbul or the Ottoman Empire, capital of course was Istanbul, and only later on, we won't get into it, but only much later on did the Arab areas become parts of it. So only from the early 16th century does Palestine become a part of it. But I think what's important to remember, and this is what I'm going to bring out here, is how connected the two are. And I think I mentioned last class that I had joked with a friend that Jerusalem, despite the geographical distance, could be argued to be almost a suburb of Istanbul. And hopefully in my future work, I'm going to be talking about that. So I start with just a picture of a newspaper that I had shown you briefly. And as you can see from the Latin characters here, it's El Tiempo. And I only brought this up to show you. We'll be talking about David Fresco, the editor, a bit later. But El Tiempo was the newspaper. And, I think it's always interesting, even for those that know and for those that don't know, that even in the first years, 20 years ago, when I went to Turkey, I was in Kurtuluş, and that's where I lived for some time. And when you go into the supermarket, you could still hear Ladino spoken. And I had neighbors that would say, "Buenos dias, ¿cómo estás?" And I remember the first time before I became an expert on Turkey or Turkish Jews or late Ottoman history, I have to admit, I was even knowing basic, I was quite shocked to hear neighbors speaking Spanish. Well, I know, of course, that's from from the what they say in Hebrew, Girus Sfarad, the Jews that were expelled from Spain. But still, I think when I teach it also, it's so hard to understand how a community kept that language for 500 years. And while it is a bit, they feared it was dying out, it actually has had a revival. I had mentioned last class in Zoom. So yes, that's the name of the paper, and hopefully I'm going to start learning Ladino. I've sort of promised myself that I would do basic classes, but you see some of it's pretty easy. Periodico, Israelita, Politico, literature, and I won't butcher the language right here. My bad pronunciation, but at least I understand it. So I think that's something. And we see that there's a little advertisement here. It's not a really clear picture of Galata. We're going to come back to Galata in our talk also, one of the main, more cosmopolitan areas of Istanbul where many Jews lived. Now, tonight, when I start this off for my class, I often start off with a picture of the Great Synagogue of Edirne. And Edirne, for those that don't know, is only about 2.5 to 3 hour drive from Istanbul. When I brought my study abroad class there a couple of years ago, I was in for a nice surprise. It's a beautiful, beautiful city, and we'll be talking about it towards the end also. Now, why do I use this synagogue as a picture to show what the transformation of the Jewish community to a modern one? Well, I argue here that the Edirne synagogue brings out the unity versus the diversity of the community. So what we see is many communities coming together. Now, how is that possible? It's only possible because in 1905, anyone that does Ottoman history will know that there were huge fires throughout Istanbul, throughout Edirne, Izmir, and recently I've been going across, going through some newspapers. It's in all newspapers. I'm sure you can find it in the New York Times also. Nowadays with search engines, it's so great. But this I found from the Jewish Chronicle. And it says, quote, I inform you by telegram the day before yesterday, this is 7th of September, 1905, the day before yesterday, of the terrible conflagration which had broken out at Adrianople, that's the Roman name, and which has rendered homeless several thousands of our co-religionists. As it was impossible to obtain precise information, the censor having stopped telegrams and forbidden the paper to speak out of the catastrophe, I thought it best to take train at once to there and see for myself. The whole city is in mourning. The largest suburb of the town and the entire Jewish quarter are literally in ashes. The fire broke out in Saturday about 2 o'clock in the morning of a house. I'll just read a few more sentences. Morning of a house inhabited by an Armenian, and it rapidly assumed such proportions that it soon attacked several streets at once and divided itself into several branches. Fanned by a violent wind, the devouring element in a few hours devastated the Greek quarter. I mean, so what we're getting here, we're getting really the Ottoman city. You have the Armenian quarter, Greek quarter, you have a Muslim quarter, of course, Turkish quarter, and you're going to have also the Jewish quarter. So, and it passed to the Jewish quarter, extending as far as the banks of the river Tunja. Towards noon on Saturday, the burnt out quarters presented a frightful spectacle. The panic was indescribable. The rapidity with which the fire spread and the congestion of carts and movable objects in the streets rendered escape extremely difficult. Toward 6 o'clock in the evening, that is to say, after the last 16 hours, the conflagration, the fire finished its work of destruction. And in it, we're going to see that there were 1,620 buildings burnt down in it. The numbers included houses in the city, Yeah, so in the city there were more. Of that were 1,620 belonged to Jews. And we know that there were 13 synagogues that were burnt down. So now why do I bring this picture here? Because remember, we have to take into consideration that when we're talking about Ottoman Jews, that doesn't mean they all were together and intermarried and were one community. Rather, they were very small communities, often not even intermarrying with each other. And they had their own local synagogues. With the building of 1909, this is supposed to, it holds hundreds of people inside. This is going to replace those mini synagogues, and you're going to get one synagogue, one grand synagogue. Now, this is interesting because this is a copy of the grand synagogue in Vienna. Okay, so we have this now idea of this sort of very Western type of synagogue where everyone comes together. Okay, so that's, I think, I think this serves as a symbol for those unifying groups to unify those very, very, very diverse groups. Now, during these years, remember I'm doing the 1908 to 1914 period. And just as we saw with the synagogue coming together as one, we see also in the Hebrew press in Palestine that people, different Sephardic Jewish communities, mostly Ladino speakers, remember Judeo-Spanish, mostly Judeo-Spanish speakers are organizing into one type of organization that's going to represent them. And here the headline, it says, the awakening of the Sephardic Jews, the organization of Ottoman Jews. Okay, and here they're talking about different cities, whether it's Salonika, whether it's Izmir, whether it's Istanbul, or whether it's Jerusalem, bringing them together to discuss the future of their community. Okay, very good. Let me just see if there's anything really interesting. I just see. Yeah, we'll go ahead and move on here. So my question is, and I use this map all the time, so how and why did Ottoman Jews start to unite together? What was motivating these new cases of unity? Why were they, opting for a big community over, one united community over their smaller communities? So remember this map, I've shown it in every class. So we're talking about, once again, from Jerusalem to Damascus, to Halep, Aleppo, and then we have, of course, Izmir, Smyrna, which is in the Greek name, and then we have Istanbul up here. And this is where Edirne is, way up here. It's about an hour, 2 hours from Istanbul. Now remember, Thessaloniki is going to be here, but it's going to be lost during this period. So what happens during this period that makes this period so unique? The Sephardic Jews in the Ottoman Empire, from the Tanzimat to the Young Turk Revolution. So we're not going to get deep into Ottoman history. We'll keep this at a BA level. But what we'll say is that just an introductory class is that in 1839 to 1876, there's something called in the Ottoman lands, or in the Ottoman administration in the central government in Istanbul, the Tanzimat. And these Tanzimat was the reformation of laws which would eventually bring equality to the different groups. Now remember, I'm not going to get quite into this, but in the Islamic states, empires, Jews and Christians were part of what we call a millet system. They basically had autonomy to run their own affairs, and they paid extra taxes, which is called the jizya tax. But this tax was often collected from the community. It wasn't that Ottomans knocked on each one's door and they gave them money. It was collected through the community often. And within these Tanzimat period, there's new calls for equality. So the equality, when I teach this in my class, I explain to my students that, today in a modern world, we think, oh, they would love equality. Well, not necessarily, because it's going to transform the different communities, very much so. It's going to allow Jews and Christians, whether Greeks or Armenians, to join the benches together with a modern type of, Turk, together, a Muslim, we could say, on the same bench, on the same, school. So it really wasn't, I have to say, I think at first some of the religious groups were very upset because they're saying, let our child study in yeshiva, or of course, there would be Talmud Torah, not into a modern school. But this takes, and this is not something immediate, it's a process that culminates into a constitution in 1876. There's new calls for equality emerged within the empire. The community transformed from multiple communities to an Ottoman Jewish community. Sorry about that. Yeah, to an Ottoman Jewish community. And we have among Jews, we're going to see in a second, a new class of intellectuals emerging. And I think this is something very important to understand. We now are going to have, by the late 19th century, Jewish intellectuals, very much like David Fresco that we had talked about, the editor of El Tiempo. The community is modernizing. And with this modernization, will lead many of the Jews to choose French as their main language and not Ladino. And in Palestine, as we talked about last class, many are going to choose Hebrew as their modern language and not the other many languages that existed. Now, so I end here with the blue group right here. Jews start to integrate into the empire and develop modern notions of patriotism. Now, very importantly, this is happening parallel to Turkish Muslims or Muslims in the empire also developing this idea of modern idea of patriotism. Now let's look at from the 1876 all the way to 1908. During this period, the Jewish intellectuals start to support openly they support the revolution in 1908, the Young Turk Revolution. If you remember, when we read that little piece just now on Edirne and about the fire, the writer, the correspondent said, wait a minute, we don't know the whole story because there's censorship. So the whole Young Turk Revolution, the idea of the Young Turk Revolution was to force Abdul Hamid II to reinstate the constitution and reinstate the parliament that he had suspended 2 decades before that. After, almost immediately after the adopted constitution, Abdul Hamid II, the Sultan, spins it. So we have Jewish intellectuals are now taking an active part in the revolution in 1908. Now, during the Young Turk movement, we see it's going to be a process where the Muslim secular elite extends freedoms to non-Muslim populations, and Ottoman Jews are elected to the parliament. You have 5 Jews and 1 in the Senate elected to the parliament. So now we have Jews that are not just modern and intellectual, they're politicians, and they're within almost every debate from 1909, 1908 to around 1912. You can see them. What we're going to see is that, unfortunately, in 1911, 1912, we see one of the first times a very public anti-Semitism emerge within Istanbul. And that's going to dampen, I would say, a lot of their participation. Yes, so now let's look. This is, once again, I'm going to read something for you because when I'm teaching this class, when you hear the newspaper reports, you understand what I mean by a modern type of intellectual. And they understood also how dynamic and what period they were living in. So we're going to look at the Chief Rabbi. He was supported by the Young Turks, revolutionaries. And I argue that he connects Jerusalem, Izmir, Damascus, and Istanbul. But let's listen to the Jewish Chronicles description of him. The new chief rabbi, a Jewish sub-prefect. So there's two Jews that are going to be very important here. As I telegraphed to you the day before yesterday, Rabbi Nachum has been elected locum tenens, the chief rabbi of Turkey, by the consistoire and the Bet Din. So both by the secular communal representative of the representation of the committee and the religious representation of the committee. The choice has been warmly welcomed by all the Jews in the capital and the provinces. The chief rabbi, the communal councils, and the educational and philanthropic, I always stop at that word. Philanthropic, very good. Philanthropic institutions in Salonika, Smyrna, Izmir, Edirne, and Jerusalem, and other places have sent congratulatory telegrams to the new locum tenens. The Jewish press predicts a new era of progress from Oriental Judaism with so worthy a spiritual chief as Rabbi Nachum. Now let's hear who Rabbi Nachum is, because this will give us a sense that in Istanbul, we do have a new type of Jew. Rabbi Nachum belongs to a respected family from Magnesia, which is today Manisa in Turkey, near Izmir, and is 36 years of age. In his youth, his parents sent him to Tiberias in Palestine, where he learned Arabic, which he knows very well. He next studied the Talmud, and later he entered a superior government school in Izmir. After having completed his course there, he came to Istanbul to study law. Being desirous of entering the clergy, he requested the laminated Grand Rabbi of France, Mr. Zado Khan, to secure his admission to the rabbinical seminary in Paris. So think about this person's life until now. He's born in Manisa, 2 or 3 hours from Izmir. He ends up in Izmir. He goes to Tiberias to study, and now he's going to Paris. Mr. Nachum pursued his studies at the seminary with great success, and the Central Committee of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, the Sephardic school system, French school system, greatly interested itself in him. Mr. Nachum then entered the School of Oriental Languages and studied there for several years. So he has a great amount of secular and religious education. After having obtained his diploma as rabbi, the Alliance School took him into service and sent him to Istanbul as a teacher of their own Jewish seminary. And it goes on that he later on taught French at the Superior School of Military Engineering. So now he's teaching at an Ottoman institution French while he's also a rabbi, before he's a chief rabbi. And of course, his recent mission to Abyssinia, to Ethiopia, will be fresh in the minds of our young readers, of our readers. Chaim Nachum had made numerous trips before and after to Ethiopia to discover the Ethiopian Jews that we know of today. So it's a very fascinating person. Now let's go to the next person. His Excellent Bohar Effendi, Ashkenazi Counselor of State, has been appointed by the new cabinet sub-prefect of Constantinople. He's a native of the city and is 65 years of age. He's one of the pupils of the first school founded in the Jewish community of Constantinople, but as he had no means, the community provided him with a certain sum to enable him to complete his studies in the superior schools of the state. He entered the service of the government as a translator at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and occupied other posts before his admission into the Council of State. Bohar Effendi is recognized by Muslims as one of the most distinguished Turkish literateurs. He has also thoroughly studied Jewish science and is a consummate Hebraist. Okay, so once again, we see a modern type individual, secular education, very much stress on languages, knows Hebrew. He's teaching in the government institution. So we see that from the Tanzimat period until now, we have a real big change. Quickly, we're not going to read everything here, we'll just hear about Messi Mazdira, one of the Ottoman parliament members that was elected. Now Nissim, he comes up in my work quite a bit, and I think he's such a fascinating character because we really once again see the pride of an Ottoman Jew who says, I was elected by more Muslims than I was Jews. He always, in his interviews, he always states how not just the Jewish minority placed hope in him, but also the Muslims of Izmir. So he was born in Manisa, just like Chaim Nachum, and he was an MP. He studied law in Thessaloniki, was an MP from Izmir, serving in the parliament in Istanbul. And now we're going to see something interesting, because where you have some staunch anti-Zionists, David Fresco of the newspaper El Tiempo was very strong, one of the most staunch anti-Zionists we had. Rabbi Chaim Nachum, who we just met before Messi Mazdira, was very interesting in that he was anti-Zionist, meaning he stayed far away from the Zionist organization. Remember that even during Sultan Abdulhamid II period, Theodor Herzl had met him, and I actually have the records. The letters Theodor Herzl wrote Abdulhamid are in the archives. So one time, I have a funny joke, story. One time I was in the archives and someone comes up to me and says, hey, we have your Ataturk's letters here. I said, my Ataturk's letters? Who are you talking about? Who could that be? And they said, Theodor Herzl. So it was a funny moment. But when I got the letters from Theodor Herzl, I placed them down and I went around and I walked for about 2 hours because I said, I can't believe that I have Theodor Herzl's handwritten letters in my own hand. And then I went home and I found that they were recorded in his diaries. So they weren't something new, but still it's very important we have the original. So what is Messi Mazdira is much closer to the Zionist movement than Chaim Nachum. Chaim Nachum says, and most Jews are saying, we don't want anything to do with the Zionist organization. They want a separate state in Palestine. But remember, in the post we talked about already in the last 2 classes, in the post-1908 period, Ottoman Jews and Jews that are adopting Ottoman citizenship among the Ashkenazi population and joining the army are saying, wait a minute, maybe we have the hope that we can get a Jewish autonomous homeland in Palestine. And this is exactly what Chaim Nachum supported. He supported Jewish immigration. He did not support an independent Palestinian state, independent Jewish state in Palestine. Now, with Messi Mazdira, you see a new type of Zionism coming into Istanbul. And I think this is something that we saw was mostly transformed to a very dominant type of ideology. And that was seeing Zionism as a cultural revival, not as let's pick up and move to Palestine or move to Eretz Israel. Rather, let's support it and teach our children Hebrew in kindergarten schools. So this is what Messi Mazdira says. I chose our Hebrew language as the last national language among all other languages. In our primary schools, in our Talmud Torah schools, and in our kindergartens, Hebrew should be the language of instruction and speech. Of course, in the middle schools, which are supported by the government, Turkish should be the dominant language. And I think this really sums it up quite well. Now, during this period, you can't see the title here, and unfortunately, right here it is. Ottoman Jews start to join the army, and they are even in this one article. Now, it's going to be very interesting because later on, we're going to look at someone who's quite anti-Semitic. But in his newspaper, he writes, Musavi vatandaşlarımızı tehaluk. So it's basically I like the idea that he says Musavi. We're going to come back to that because we have this in Turkish where they say Musavi versus Yehudi. Okay, a local Jew versus a Jew outside, and this comes from the Ottoman era. So what we're seeing is that many things that are happening during this period later on go to the modern state of Turkey. So, but what does it say? I think is so fascinating. He says, our Jewish citizens, and we're going to come back to that. But he says that they are among all the other groups. He says they're in view kismi Musevi vatandaşlarımızda, right? Among all the other groups, that means Armenians, Greeks, Jews are joining the army the most. Okay, and I wish I had Jake, if I can call you out. I don't have the picture of your, I think it was your great grandfather, correct? You sent it to me, and I should have put it in here. After I finished, I said I should have put it in here. But your great grandfather was in the Ottoman army just years after this, and I think this really shows us. Correct me if I'm wrong on that note. I think maybe I can can you unmute him real fast, Ethan? Ethan, you with us? Yes, go ahead, Jake. Yes, go ahead, please. Your grandfather. Okay, perfect.
My grandfather, who I'm named after.
Yes, yes. And maybe if you have the picture on your computer and you want to share with us, that would be thrilling. I'm sorry I don't have it. You sent it to me and I had meant to put it in here. But if you find it, just raise your hand and I'll let you put it up. Let's wait till the end of the when I close this, and then we can do that. Because I think it's a beautiful photo, and it was in the museum of the Jewish Museum in Istanbul. It was in Çanakkale. I think it's just fascinating.
The 500-year museum.
Exactly. So we'll come back. Maybe at the end, if you find it, you can bring that up. Okay, good. Now, Ottoman anti-Semitism. Now, what do we have here? And this is, we only have about 5 or 10 minutes. I'm, in my work, unfortunately, and I just presented a paper 2 or 3 days ago, last week and last Saturday, Friday and Saturday, there was a conference on anti-Semitism in the Ottoman Empire in modern Turkey. And I actually, in my book also, I write about Ottoman anti-Semitism. First of all, let me take a step back and say, it's very hard to define what we mean by anti-Semitism during the late Ottoman era. There's different times and different places. The empire is really big. So when there's anti-Semitism sometimes among Christian communities against Jews, let's say if it's in Bulgaria, that is a very specific, very Slavic type anti-Semitism. We know that from last week we had talked about that there were stories in Egypt of blood libels, claiming the idea that Jews are kidnapping kids for I don't even like to talk about that. Just say look up blood libels. I can't even say it with every time I say, when something's so anti-Semitic, you don't even want to say it because you don't believe what you're saying is the case, I think. But so very harsh, sort of traditional anti-Semitism from Europe. Then you have also the pre-modern anti-Semitism, you could argue, of which is not much different than tensions between other non-Muslim groups, vis-a-vis the Muslim Turks, the Turkish Muslim groups, or the different Muslim groups. So it's very hard to define it. So I don't want to say Ottoman anti-Semitism, but what I can say is by 1908 you have or 1910-12 you have a very public anti-Semitism that's going to be based on conspiracy theories, and it's going to be actually used. Often it's going to be wrapped in this anti-Zionist narrative. So I'm going to show you in a second. So conspiracies ran rampant that the Zionists were behind the Young Turk Revolution because the Jews had become so close to the government. during this period. Many of their opponents knowingly and willingly spread lies trying to place the revolution on the Jewish community. So that's the first thing. And what we don't know, and that was also spread originally by the British ambassador. This is also in my book. Now we also have fears of by the Jewish philanthropist Israel Zangwill. We have Israel Zangwill is an interesting character. He is a Jew that was a territorialist. He said we need to solve the Jewish question of Russia, and we need to move them out of Russia. They're suffering pogroms. They're suffering what do you call it? Starvation. And they're impoverished. Let's move them out. So wherever we can find a place, let's move them. So Israel Zangwill, people that don't know, he actually wrote the play The Melting Pot about the United States, and it was his sort of play that led to the Americans adopting the idea of America being a melting pot. At the same time, in 1909, he embarks on an ambitious project to settle Jews in Iraq. So what I found out later on was that the anti-Zionism debates that were happening in parliament or in other places in the press was actually about Iraq, and it wasn't about Mesopotamia, and it wasn't about Palestine. Okay, and then you have, like I said, Jewish politicians become identified with staunchly pro-government CUP, Committee of Union and Progress. Yeah. Now, one of the editors that I talked about, Abu Zia Tefik, who I just said that he see, on one hand, he says Jews are the most loyal, but he says our Jews, the newspaper, meaning local Jewish community. And he tried to even, and I'm going to be working on this in the future, he tries to divide Jews, local Jews, and call them Musevi, the followers of the Mosaic faith, versus the conspiracists, the world conspiracy, groups that were Yehudi, Jews outside of Turkey. Jews in the Ottoman Empire did not accept this. And we know that in modern Turkey, this comes over, right? That whole debate where you ask someone and say, well, what's the difference between a Musevi and a Yehudi? And sometimes you'll get really interesting answers from people that don't know that they're exactly the same thing. Okay. Now, what does Abu Zia write about this fear of Jews going to Iraq? He says, we are confident that those Jews which will be transferred to Iraq will not work in agriculture, but rather be those who watch their accounts carefully, even as they appear to be simple and pure individuals, and they'll bring disasters and calamity, such as the plague of locusts, which will spread over the Ottoman lands. Perhaps now the Jews which wish to be transferred are not in the thousands, but in the hundreds of thousands, and even millions are being discussed. Now, if there are not thousands of Jewish farmers, what will the hundreds of thousands of Jews be preoccupied? And this is just one sample of it. I mean, you get into sort of a classical and modern type anti-Semitism that talks about Jewish conspiracy theories. He actually interestingly goes into this whole long narrative and said that the Greeks of the empire should be most worried because they're the most like the Jews abroad. They work in business, and the Jews are going to come and take their work. So this is a debate that's happening between 1909 to 1911 in numerous newspapers. Now, we don't have much time to talk about this. There are modern Zionists from Palestine coming in to Istanbul. One of them, of course, was the future the first prime minister of the Israeli state, David Ben-Gurion, the iconic leader. And he actually starts what they call the Agudat HaMitlamdim HaIvrim HaOthmani Bokushta. So it's the student union, the Hebrew student union of Ottoman Hebrews. The Hebrew student union in the Ottoman Hebrew student union in Istanbul. Istanbul in Hebrew, for those that don't know, it's Kushta. Okay, so it's the Ottoman Hebrew Student Union. And it's really interesting to see that what I argued in our first lecture was that people really didn't know David Ben Gurion there. And if you read Israeli history, they're not going to, they mention that he was in Istanbul. They don't do anything with it. Because if they did anything with it, that would mean that he didn't foresee that an independent Jewish state was possible. Rather, he was there studying law and hoping to enter the parliament. Now, we also, during this period, have Zionist Club starting. This is the one of the Maccabi Sports Club that many people know. And this is an official investigation. This is some of the work I do is working with Ottoman documents. So this is, it just says, for the ones that understand, Maccabi Nami Musavi Jamiati Esasen Musavi Gençleri falan falan. It goes on. So it goes into a great detail about if they are supporting an independence movement, right here, Jami Istiklal, which is going to be Zionism, Zionism right here. It's right there, Zionism. So we have numerous documents during this period of Ottoman authorities questioning the different clubs of young youth. So what we do have at the end of the last years in the empire is, I would say, a lot of confusion over what Zionism is in Palestine, what it is in the capital, and how it's related, surprisingly, to the settlement of Jews in what today would be Iraq, in Ottoman Iraq or Mesopotamia. So I think what we see here is quite a bit, a very dynamic period for Jews. But what is this going to lead to, unfortunately? Unfortunately, first I'm going to say, I'm going to read this and I'll come back to my main conclusion. World War I would create borders now, we had talked about, would place new divisions within the Sephardic community, which was inherently not necessarily tied to one center. The Istanbul Center is going to lose, its position of being representative of the Istanbul Jewish community, a representative of Jerusalem, of Damascus, of Baghdad. Remember, all these places were there. Now it's going to transform into the center for Turkish Jewish life. And we know today that most all the smaller communities over time, due to also anti-Semitism, due to economic conditions, due to numerous reasons, many of the Jews from the rural areas either migrate to the cities or they migrated abroad, and especially to the new state of Israel, or the years right before the Palestine, right before the founding of the state. Rise of local nationalism comes into play here. For many Greek and Turkish Jews, it was the beginning of the exiting from the homeland to the new old homeland. We, of course, last week recognized, Joe Biden recognized the Armenian genocide. And it's, I think the hardest thing to explain, I was writing on Twitter, is that we see at the end of the empire, especially at the Young Turk Revolution, we see a moment in history where the most progressive politics were happening in Istanbul, the greatest chance for some kind of equality between the different groups. And that would greatly change in the last years. For the Jewish community, to sum up, unfortunately, what we're going to see is that they are no longer allotted that much space within the political system. So what we saw in 1908, the elections of 5 members of a group that were represented within the main government. I mean, there were main government people. That's not going to happen again. Of course, you're going to have Jewish politicians in modern Turkey, but it's going to be, the dynamic is going to be very different. And then I write here, Sephardic Jews from Palestine, such as Avram el-Meliach that we talked about last week, would transform and forced into new reality. He is someone that was born in Jerusalem. He was one of, he's a Hebraist. He studied with David Ben Gurion, Eliezer ben Yehuda. Then he comes to Istanbul in 1910 with Rabbi Nachum that I talked about. He teaches in Hebrew in the Istanbul schools. He also works for the Maccabi clubs, ends up in Damascus, back to Palestine, and World War I happens. So he's going to be cut off from Istanbul. So it's just not that Istanbul's cut off from the Jewish community in Eretz Israel or in Palestine, the Ottoman Jews there, and all others, I would say, but they also are going to be cut off from Istanbul. I'm not going to talk about right now. I won't even get into the legacy of the Turkish Jews. Maybe perhaps Ethan in the future, maybe next semester, I could give a class on modern Turkey. I'm sure you have plenty of people that might have already given talks on that, but I could give you, sort of continuation of how this plays out into modern Turkey. And the last question is, if Jake, do you have the picture of your grandfather? Do you know how to share the screen? Ethan, does he have it? Okay, perfect. We can see. Let me stop sharing mine. Let me stop sharing mine. Yeah, beautiful photo of your grandfather. Could you tell us, Jake, where he was?
We believe in the Dardanelles or
Where he was born?
area. Can you hear me?
Okay, perfect.
Am I unmuted?
Perfect. And this is from World War I, correct?
Yes. What happened there?
Go back.
Please, I don't want that.
Yeah, exactly. Go. Don't. Yeah, maybe just cancel.
Sorry. What happened to the picture? I lost it.
I think some. Did you all get a chance to see it? Maybe close it and reopen it. Just close everything and reopen it. Let's try one more time.
Hold on a second. I know where it is. Here it is. I got it. 1 second.
Perfect. Perfect. Thanks so much. There. I'm so happy.
There it is. Okay.
I had meant to put it. Yes. So this is what a proud Ottoman Jewish soldier looked like in World War I, or the years before World War I. So and it's your grandfather. So that's certainly a very personal memory.
I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Great.
Okay.
I have time for questions. I just want to say before also, Ethan, thanks so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure, and I see so many people that are coming back to this lecture for the last 3 lectures. So it's been a real pleasure. So thanks so much there.
Professor Louis Fishman, thank you so much for those kind words, and we're really just honored to have you. And inshallah, it's going to be one of, God willing, more courses, like we said, maybe something in the fall, back when the semester starts again, for sure. We'll now open it up to questions. If you have any questions, we ask if you enter them into the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. First question, an interesting one from the chat. What interactions existed between the Sephardic Jews and the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire?
So, I didn't have time to bring up, but often in my also in my book, and I had it here. I knew I was going to run out of time, so I wasn't able to put it in. But on the debate in Zionism, the parliament, to sort of show the confusion of what's happening. The greatest defender of Zionism is a man named Vartkis Bey, and Vartkis unfortunately is actually killed in the genocide. He's one of the first ones that's sent from Istanbul on April 24th, actually. And he gives a speech. I just brought it up here, and he's very confused. He's arguing now. What's happening in the talk? The Palestinians, Ruhiya Khalidi and Saida Husseini, are actually very level-headed people, the farthest you can get away from being anti-Semitic. So they come and they say, the Jewish community is becoming stronger, and they're slowly buying more lands. We're losing our influence. We're losing our position that we had in Palestine. And they're sincere. Now, the problem is that they were government, pro-government, together with the Jewish groups, together with Messi Mazdira. So when they brought their anti-Zionist narrative to the parliament, immediately this anti-Semitic man I talked about, Ebuzi Tefik, and others start questioning Zionism and saying it's this, this, and this. Now, for the Palestinians, they are not buying into this world conspiracy theory, and they're not using that as their argument. So what's interesting is that they put them on the side of the government. Okay. Now, also at the same time, when the parliament floor breaks out in chaos over the debate on Zionism, Vartkis Bey stands up and says, "Listen, why are you attacking these Jews? Just because, and the language you're using, if the popular masses," and that's an idea about anti-Semitism in the Ottoman Empire. Everyone says that it's not something that happens among urban educated folk, but if it goes to the masses and they hear about this, certainly the Jews could suffer a wave of anti-Semitism, of attacks. And then the Armenian parliamentarian says, and you know what? In the end, we'll pay for it, because we always pay for it in the end. We are the ones that suffer the most attacks. Remember, there was a major massacre in Adana in 1909, and there was already in the 1890s numerous attacks on the community, and tensions rising high. So so the question is, what were their relations? Honestly enough, they didn't have very good relations. And Vartkis, in his speech, he says that. He says, what's in it for me? We have nothing. We have nothing here. And then he says, just like the Jews' homeland is the land of Israel, Eretz Israel, he says, or the Holy Land, he says, our home is in the mountains of Anatolia. It's very interesting to hear him say that. And the debate really spirals out of control. Another person, very famous, Moise Cohen, I didn't talk about today, later who will become a Turkish nationalist. He also talks about they need to work on relations with Armenians, because what happens is, especially in the post-1908 period, each community is put in competition vis-a-vis the secular Muslim elite to a great extent. But they know, they're aware of this, and Jews and Armenians and Jews and Greeks, and especially Jews and Armenians, for whatever reason, are coming closer. This is sort of my sense of things.
Great. Another question here from the chat. We got a lot of good questions in English. Is wonderful. Early in the period of your study, in 1909, a series of pogroms of Armenians occurred in Adana province. Many Armenians who, like the Jews, right, exactly like the Jews, had embraced the revolution of 1908 in the hope of equal Ottoman citizenship, were disillusioned. How do these events affect the general pro-Ottoman worldview of the old Yeshuv leaders?
The Adana massacres, it'd be really interesting to see how this plays out in the press. I'm doing most of the press from 1910, 1911 on. And the old Yeshuv, the Yeshuv itself is writing quite a bit about the Armenian massacres, and different, even small. Sometimes there was one case, I forget when it was, 1910 or something, 1911. Later on, this village that suffered attacks, and it was in the Jewish press, and I've never been able to find any mention of it anywhere else. That's an interesting question. How did this play out? I couldn't tell you, but after 1909, remember that the Adana massacres are connected inherently to the struggle against Abdul Hamid II. So it's sort of, once Abdul Hamid II is, moved out, he's expelled from his rule, then it's sort of a new leaf has been turned. What we see though is that between, I really, this idea of, so many scholars have looked at equality between the different groups. What I'm seeing is that there is this language of equality, but there's a lot of tensions. And when you see the parliament debates, you start hearing this. For example, Vartkis Bey, in the same parliament debate, he says, you are the ones that, he says something, my father was beheaded. This is his exact words. And I'm one of the first people that discovered this. It was there, but people haven't read it. And I thought I was misreading something. I thought I didn't. No, that's what it was. Kafe Kesti, I believe. And then a Turkish person stands up and says, "Are you calling us savages, Vahshi?" And he says, "No, I'm calling the person that killed my father, Vahshi. I'm calling him savage, not everyone." Right? So it was there were a lot of tinge, but it was a very interesting experiment. But like we said, that experiment that radically failed, we know that's from 1915. We know this from the Greek Muslim exchange, the Greek-Turkish exchange in 1923, the attacks on the Greek community. And we know that in the 20s and 30s, which maybe in the future I could talk about, later on the pogrom in Edirne, where I just showed you the beautiful synagogue, is going to suffer greatly. And then other events on attacks on different Jewish communities in the early years of the Republic. So I think a lot of what we're seeing in 1908, 1909, 1914, 15 is going to continue in a different form within the Republic of Turkey.
Can you comment at all a little bit about the relationship between the Hacham Bashi of the empire at the time in Istanbul and the Rishon LeZion, the chief Hacham Bashi of the old Yeshuv, then I think it was Yaakov Meir, and what that kind of relationship was like at the time?
Yeah, I couldn't answer the question, but I know it wasn't good. And that's what I know that you know they were very interested in getting. I mean, with the Young Turk Revolution, also came a revolution within the Jewish communities, and Chaim Nachum was a very, very political rabbi. He remains very political. Later on, he helped Turkish diplomats in the post-World War I period. Then he later goes and becomes the chief rabbi of Egypt, and he actually remains a staunch anti-Zionist in that sense. In the new, what I argue is what anti-Zionism is in the late Ottoman period. By the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, when Chaim Nachum takes his chief rabbi in Egypt, it really turns into a modern type of anti-Zionism that we know more of today. So yeah, I think when people from just not that when we talk about old Yeshuv, new Yeshuv, we can talk, pre-revolution and after revolution and how this changed.
And one last question over here. Let's see. Oh, can you comment? An interesting question. Can you comment at all about the use of Samach Tet in some of the documents you've seen, so the Sof Tov that you've seen in some of the rabbinic documents?
Were they in my documents here?
Yeah, or just someone had the question of what that it meant, and I would assume that.
To tell the truth, that up on the top, I think it's just something, writing something. Where was it? In which document, if I could see it?
So from my understanding, at least, the Samach Tet, when many rabbis or other leaders would write at the end of their name, Sof Tov, they should have a good end, but often.
Sof Tov, yeah. I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to know that. So Sof Tov, that makes sense, but yeah.
Okay, I think that's all the time we have this evening. I just want to thank Professor Fishman again so much for this wonderful 3-part series. I mean, really just fantastic. We've had so much praise from it. So you should be really proud of it for sure. And we're really grateful to have you. Inshallah.
Perfect. Can I give a shout out? I'm so happy to see. I'm so happy to see Rose here that I've known for years. Hey there. It's from when I was way back, my days in California. My sister Janet is here, and I'm seeing other people. I see Nasia friend here, good friend here, and I see Nasim, a student here. Hi Nasim. I'm seeing so many people, and the last lectures I didn't get to say, and I'm sure I'm missing people here because I'm going through. So it was great seeing. It's great seeing all of you, and hopefully we'll meet in the future, maybe live in like a real classroom or something.
Well, actually, you know what? I'm going to sneak in one last question here because I think it's actually very, very good.
Okay, absolutely.
Are there any examples you know of countries and cultures today that retain some similar form of diverse national identities that existed in the late Ottoman Empire, in contrast to the modern idea of the nation state?
I want to go off on a limb and talk about comparisons, but I would say that the Sephardic example of keeping a language for 500 years. When I teach it, I actually say that it's the best example to see how pre-modern remained within the modern. What do I mean by that? With modern identity, we all lose our languages. Most people lose our languages. I teach in Brooklyn College, and we have 100 different languages spoken at Brooklyn College. Of those 100 different languages, their children might know a little bit, but their grandchildren definitely will not know that language. When they say our history, a lot of my students, they're talking after one generation here. They're talking about American history. They're not talking about their own family's history. With the rise of the state of Israel, very much in the same way, was to learn Hebrew and to forget your former language. And we know that the cost of that languages like Yiddish and Ladino and Judeo-Arabic have disappeared, for better or for worse. I mean, that's history, right? But looking at the Sephardic community and bringing it back to that moment where I talked about when I was walking in a supermarket and I hear Ladino, that's pretty fascinating. And I think the nation state, of course, was such a struggle for communities like the Sephardic community and the other different ones, the Italian Jewish community, and it just wasn't that. This idea that you don't belong, your borders or your community is transnational, and that is something very, very unique. And I don't know of any community like this. We know within Turkey that you have Circassians, Cherkess, for example, that have very similar ideas of keeping their culture. You have Cherkess in Israel and in Jordan and different places like this, right? So I think that's an example that comes to mind that you could obviously you could say that they're keeping their culture and stuff like that. You have people that kept their culture despite without getting into politics, despite the nation state, and that would be Kurds in Turkey, for example. Trying to cling on to that language, to linguistics, and stuff and like this. So it's very different in that case, but I think it's very similar in many ways.
Great note to end on. Professor, thank you so much again for the time. Thank you all so much for joining us. If you missed any part of this program, by the way, you can check out our YouTube page. So go check out, just Google Sephardic Brotherhood, search Sephardic Brotherhood on YouTube. You can also check out our Facebook page as well, where we live stream all the programs. So you can check those out and see all the other past programs as well that we've had before.